I will introduce our second speaker here, who is going to be Mr. Cliff Kiracofe. And Cliff is a professor at the Virginia Military Institute, and he also teaches at Washington and Lee University. He is a 12-year staffer he was 12 years staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I'm sure he'll tell you a bit more about himself. So I would like to introduce to you Mr. Kiracofe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Keisha, and I also extend my thanks to all the members of the Schiller Institute, to Helga, to Lynn for being such an inspiration over all these years, and it's just great to be here with you all this afternoon. Now, walking into the building today, I was talking to my buddy Jeff Steinberg. We've been creating mischief for, I think, over 3 decades now, and I said, you know, I've been in this area, but the last time I was in this area was like about 1968 when we were, doing all the. Some of you guys will remember that, the anti-war situation. So I'm so happy to be in this building with this great history behind this building, and with activists, and who are actually we're more militant today, I think, than we were in '68, or at least I think I am, or at least I want to be. Okay. My task today, my assigned task, was to talk a little bit about American history and a little bit about John Quincy Adams, and to put some of our maybe present foreign policy into historical context so we can kind of compare and contrast. First up, I was really interested in the points that Helga was making in the first panel about paradigm shift. And one of the things that occurred to me as I listened to her was this idea, paradigm shift. Well, let's recover some of our values. And Bruce Fein was very inspirational in that too, in his awesome remarks. Recovering some values so that we can go forward creatively. Right? So to get this paradigm shift. And when we're going forward creatively, I also agree that we have to try to change the world. And from my kind of international relations point of view, foreign policy, diplomatic point of view, I'm interested in the international system and transforming it. I don't like the system we have now. So we have to transform the international system. That's what we need to do. Now, with that in mind, let's go back and look a little bit at John Quincy Adams. I have about 20 minutes of talking, and then I'd love to have questions afterwards on contemporary foreign policy issues. But I'm going to try to set up the historical background right now. First, I'm going to focus on John Quincy Adams and traditional values in American foreign policy. Before I get into the historical background, I want to make 3 main points. I mean, I could even stop my speech after these. But point 1, John Quincy Adams believed in a foreign policy of peace, through diplomacy, through international law. And he believed in a policy of development, economic, social development, through international cooperation and commerce. And commerce in a big sense, interchange of goods and services and ideas and cultural interaction. So a bigger definition of commerce than we might normally make it, like trade. 2, Adams opposed intervention into the internal affairs of sovereign states. As it was pointed out in the first panel, he wasn't interested in going forth and seeking monsters to destroy, intervening in the affairs of sovereign states abroad. And 3, Adams opposed imperialism. Boom. So those are the 3 things that I think are most typical of John Quincy Adams' legacy, in terms of really key principles, key values that should be incorporated into American foreign policy today. Now, what I'm going to do is I have basically 3 parts. I'm going to sketch out a little bit of a traditional American understanding of our foreign policy and ourselves within the world. Then I'll talk a little bit about John Quincy Adams himself, his background. And then thirdly, I'll kind of wrap up, trying to bring the historical context all the way up to fairly recent times. So a traditional American perspective on our nation's history would highlight the goals of sovereign independence and economic well-being, social and economic well-being, and also the dangers of encirclement, civil war, division. And in this regard, let me make 4 points. Point 1, our colonial period from 1609 to 1776, let's say, demonstrated that we are not at all isolated from world politics. Never have been. In fact, it was a challenge to maintain our security, given that we and our small colonies along the Atlantic seaboard were encircled by formidable imperial powers. Britain and France to our north, Spain, etc., to our south, west, France later west. European politics and diplomacy and war have always directly impacted our security and well-being, and other parts of the world as well. We've never been isolated from world politics. So I want us to dispense with any notions of being isolated. We want to engage the world in a constructive and a positive way. We want to transform the international system into a positive international system. Now, the 7 Years' War, point 2. 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, in which the British Empire nullified French power to our north, resulted in our increasing vulnerability to British imperial power by eliminating our potential French ally in Canada. The road was cleared then for an ever-increasing imperial restriction of our rights and for the limitation of our economic and geographic potential by the imperial power, Britain. This was, of course, the cause of our American Revolution, or part of the cause. Point 3. American success in the War of 1812, again, the British Empire was trying to stifle us through military means, put a check on British designs to reverse the results of our American Revolution. As a consequence, we were able to populate and develop our country to the point where we stood as the third industrial power by 1850, behind the British and the French empires. However, for some years, reactionary circles in Britain and France sought a way to break up our American Union and thereby nullify the economic threat to the United States posed by these two empires. 4th point. Britain and France conspired in a design to divide and rule our republic, our country, by separating the North and South via the mechanism of a civil war. Some of the designs included placing a Grand Duke from Austria, Maximilian, on the throne of Mexico. The British, playing various sides, were aiding the southern slave power, and that's what we used to call it in the old days, the slave power, which is what it was, in the South. And in one scenario, Texas might have been taken away from our republic, our union, and served as a buffer state and kind of a little toy of the British. Owing to President Lincoln's leadership, and to the victory of the Union military forces, however, this design failed and our Union, thank God, was preserved. And I think the recent Spielberg movie was fabulous, really kind of refreshing our minds and our memories of what we all were struggling for back in that period of time. All right, now let me turn a little bit to John Quincy Adams, just to give us a little sense of his background and preparation and the quality of our diplomacy in the early years of the Founding Fathers. Now, John Quincy Adams, as we know, was the son of President John Adams, and from an early age he was educated to a life of public service. He accompanied his dad, who was an American envoy to France back in 1778-79, and later to the Netherlands, 1780-82. We were trying to negotiate a loan from the Netherlands at that time. So young John Quincy was accompanying his dad and thereby learning firsthand about international affairs and diplomacy. He studied at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands and learned the Dutch language as a consequence. And of course, we can remember the great humanist Erasmus had a relationship to the University at Leiden. With this experience under his belt, young John Quincy Adams then accompanied Mr. Francis Dana as our envoy to St. Petersburg, Russia, in trying to secure the recognition of Russia to our fledgling young republic. As a consequence of this activity, he begins to learn some Russian and also forges that deep interest in U.S.-Russian relations, a positive U.S.-Russian relations. Then, during this time, he traveled to Sweden, Finland, Denmark. He learned French and Dutch and became familiar with German, important, and other European languages. Returning to the Boston area, he graduated from Harvard, earned a master's degree, and went on to study and practice law. Now, here's where the diplomacy starts to come in on his own account. In 1793, President George Washington appointed young, 26 years old, John Quincy Adams as our minister to the Netherlands. Back in those days, we didn't have ambassadors. We had ministers. That was the highest rank. Next, President George Washington in 1796 appoints him as our minister to Portugal. And following that, he's appointed to the minister of Prussia in Berlin by his own father, who was then president. So we can see the development of this very young John Quincy Adams within the sort of the maelstrom of European power politics and imperial dynastic politics in the day, and also developing deep cultural relations with various European circles, which we would call today progressive circles. Okay. Now, following that, it's interesting to note that some of the correspondence between John Quincy Adams and his dad found their way to President George Washington when he was writing his famous farewell address. So some of the concepts and values, which is in this all-important document, the farewell address by George Washington, some of those concepts and values that are expressed by President Washington incorporated some of the thoughts and concerns and concepts of young John Quincy Adams, the diplomat. President James Madison appointed John Quincy Adams in 1809 as our first full-fledged minister, or we would say ambassador, but minister, to St. Petersburg, where he served until 1814. He was aware of the Napoleonic Wars, and he also served to later negotiate the Treaty of Ghent, which ended our war of 1812 with England. Returning to the United States, James Monroe appoints our John Quincy as Secretary of State, a cabinet position he held until 1825. His masterful diplomacy gains Florida, parts of the West. We have a treaty with Spain, etc. Mutual benefit, of course, mutual respect, mutual benefit are part of these diplomatic concepts from this old traditional period of time. And also, he was the author in many ways of the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which simply meant that we wanted to restrict the European imperial powers from messing around in our new world, from undermining the potential independence of South American states. And the idea of the Monroe Doctrine then was to create a community of principle under law, and where we would have commerce, cultural interaction, and we would be protected from intervention by European imperial powers. I would want to make a comment while I'm at this point of other young Americans did go to Europe to study during this period of time, study history in particular, and it's, I guess, appropriate for the Schiller Institute. The locus of study for many of these young Americans was at the University of Göttingen in Germany. And a number of our early diplomats, people who would become diplomats, studied at this particular university in Germany, not in England. And there was a professor there, Professor Arnold Hermann Ludwig Herren, who taught philosophy and history. And I want to point out that many of our young persons who studied there studied under him and went on to become American diplomats, to include George Bancroft, who was the first American to earn a PhD degree. And who did he earn it from? The University of Göttingen. Who was his professor? Professor Herren. Professor Herren wrote very fascinating books on European history and also ancient Greek history. And his innovations in European history particularly included his focus on economics and financial dimensions of the European state system, Staatssystem. All right. So I guess a little idea of the culture we had in the 19th century, early 19th century, is this of American diplomacy. Respectful of international law, the concepts of Grotius, particularly also Pufendorf, another German writer on international law, Vattel. There was this concept of the United States as a young republic moving in an international community wherein international law was important, and where international law was a consideration, to be sure, moral and ethical. And this sort of stems out of the Westphalian 1648, as we know, the Westphalian settlements, and this ethos of a European state system actually became transformed into this idea of the ethos of a global international system under law, if we read Grotius or Pufendorf in particular. Okay, now moving from that, does present-day American foreign policy resemble anything that John Quincy Adams and the Founding Fathers would have wanted and approved? Of course not. That's a simple answer there. Washington today is caught up in a policy of imperialism launched in 1898 by the Spanish-American War. By imperialism, I will just use basically Professor Hobson's classic discussion of imperialism in his classic book, Imperialism. So this is the idea of the domination, which Bruce Fein referred to, the domination of various geographic parts of our planet through military means, overt military force, or financial means, economic imperialism, finance capitalism, right? We can remember that from the 60s, right? Okay. I would correct Lenin and Marx. We've had 200 years of experience, or 150 or so years of experience since Marx and all those guys were done. It's not the means of production, it's the means of finance. It's the means of finance. I want us to think about that. The means of finance. That's the issue. When we start talking about the international financial picture today and the fascism creeping through Europe today, the techno-fascism in Europe, this is finance. It's not means of production, it's finance, means of finance. Okay. Now, as a result of the 1898 war against Spain, well, that's the beginning of our imperial faction in our politics. We didn't have these characters before. They were lurking around, kind of, subservient to the British crown, doing bad things here and there. But we never had this whole movement toward imperialism until 1898 in the Spanish-American War. As a result of that war, in the national election of 1900, imperialism was a major campaign issue by the Democratic Party. They were accusing the Republican Party of a policy of imperialism, and they didn't like it. So imperialism in the political discourse of the United States, in terms of foreign policy, is nothing new. It's in the Democratic platform of 1900. So let's think about that too. Keep that in the back of our mind. Now, shortly thereafter, Democrats under Woodrow Wilson fell into this policy themselves, or factions of the Democrats. So we can say that we've had an imperial faction in both political parties since about 1898. We've also had, which Blinn and staunchly represents, an anti-imperial faction in the United States. So we've had this back and forth now for well over a century between these competing goals and competing visions for the United States. What I'll do is I'll do six points and then conclude, allowing some time later for questions, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions on contemporary policy if you want to talk about Mali or you want to talk about Iran or, China. Well, fine. But let me just do the historical stuff first. Point one. After our Civil War, a different approach to the U.S. was set in motion by our former colonial power, the British Empire. In contrast, in the context of the rise of Germany, and thus Anglo-German imperial rivalry, the British sought to enlist the support of the United States through elite circles susceptible to British influence of one kind or another. At the same time, certain elite circles in the United States were encouraged to develop an imperial outlook favorable to London, rather than to maintain our own traditional outlook of trying to build a strong and independent republic. Not an empire, a strong and independent republic. Point 2, and I'm going to have 6 points. In the United States, the imperial faction in 1898 launched a wholly unnecessary war against Spain and thereby obtained the Philippines as a colony. The British quietly supported this action as London calculated it would cut against expanding German influence in the Pacific and would promote closer relations between the British Empire and elites in the United States. Such relations would be useful in British calculations for the coming war in 1814. I just said 1898. So how long is from 1898 to the coming war in 1914? Which was sort of set up, of course, in the early 1890s by the British, French, and Russian sort of triple alliance in a way, kind of to contain Germany. I want us to bear that containing Germany in mind, because who are we containing these days? China, right? Okay, or trying to. The ascendancy and dominance of American imperial faction followed the Spanish-American War of 1898, and as I just mentioned, imperialism as the United States foreign policy became a national political issue in those 1900 elections. The people who opposed imperialism were called isolationists. Oh, they're isolationists. They don't want to be imperialists. Huh? Hello? Non-interventionists might be a better phrase, not isolationists. Anti-imperialists might be a better phrase. Okay, as I mentioned, the Democratic Party fell under the sway of the imperial faction during President Wilson's presidency. We can all remember Edward Mandell House and a whole bunch of those advisors advising President Wilson in this kind of direction. Now I'll jump. Point 4 of 6. At the end of the Cold War, caused by the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States had a historic foreign policy and national strategy choice to make. Our imperial faction, then dominant, proposed the vain, unsustainable policy to become a global hegemon in a so-called unipolar world, which they sought to create. Traditional patriotic circles proposed that we peacefully coexist as a strong republic, all right, a responsible great power, all right, within an emerging multipolar world, which respected sovereignty, mutual benefit, international law, common development, these giant projects that are so fantastic that we've seen today, a world of peace and development. Point 5, the Bush administration's unnecessary and disastrous Iraq and Afghan wars will cost the United States an estimated $5 trillion by 2020. That's not even to mention the outlying years after that. So we just shot $5 trillion. As General Bill Odom, former head of the National Security Agency, said at the time, the strategic decision to go to war against Iraq is the greatest strategic mistake in the history of the United States. That's General William Odom, the former head of the National Security Agency, which is like much gianter than the CIA or any of these guys. It's like really serious. And here he's saying, you know, this is the greatest strategic mistake our country's ever made. And he's a general, or was. He passed away, unfortunately. The imperial faction has learned nothing from the failure of its unnecessary and costly wars in Korea, Vietnam, remember that one? A lot of us were out there. In fact, there's a marked continuity in policy and personnel from the old anti-communist China lobby to the Korean War, to the Vietnam War, and now to the wars with Iraq, Afghanistan, and now to the present policy of so-called managing the rise of China. I'll just say parenthetically really quickly, but before I wrap up, back in 2001, I was at the State Department for a few days of briefings on U.S. foreign policy as this new administration was coming in. And a lot of the luminaries were there. And we heard from all manner of different top folks at State kind of briefing us as what's to come. I'll never forget one of the presentations by Dick Armitage, who was a high muckety-muck back in that day and age. And Dick Armitage was giving us kind of a walk around the world strategically. And he said, yeah, and what we got to focus on now is we got to, we're going to work on managing the rise of India and China. I'm thinking to myself, just a minute, what's this guy talking about? Where's his head? What is his head wrapped around? We, the United States, are going to be managing the rise of like 1 billion or so Indians and 1.5 billion Chinese, and we're going to be managing and telling them what to do and how to fit into the international system that we created and all of that. So I'm thinking to myself, man, these guys, you know, whew. And that's not to mention the Iraq stuff, the Iraq war. Point 6, it's a very short point, although I can expand on it. My short point has about 5 words, and that's the end of my talk. Point 6, nothing has changed under Obama. That's it. Okay? Thank you.